Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I am I'm going to just get started. Please, I understand this is your lunch break, so that means that I'm going to be talking in competition with your eating. Totally happy with that. That's a part of wellness. Um, my name is Xenia Bhembe. I am a pediatric and adult board certified psychiatrist, also assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. And I am going to have a discussion today about how to prevent burnout in Black storytellers. And I am a huge fan of journalists and those who work and produce from the newsroom. And have found that there's ways in which my life as a psychiatrist parallels the life of those who are telling the stories of our lives. And we report, it's hard to talk about journalism without thinking about all that has to go into being incorporated in the person and in your everyday experience as you craft the stories that the rest of us so enjoy. And so oftentimes it's really hard for those of us in the community following the narratives to really grasp what's really happening and how much has to go into filtering out what comes at you. And while I'm not an expert on burnout, and certainly I'm going to veer a bit out of the context of what might be the official term of burnout. What I do recognize is that there are ways in which, as journalists, as Black journalists, we're up against a huge push to incorporate ourselves into stories without being seen, sort of to be the blank slate. And that's the place where I, as a psychiatrist, and those of us who are storytellers in the journalism world merge. There is a balance between my ability to be a blank slate when I'm in a room, and the narrative writer or the journalist to be a blank slate as well. And a lot of times what that does is it allows us the anonymity to be able to tell a story generally. But what it also does is that sometimes it can make us so invisible that the things that we're up against when we're coming across the trauma that is at the heart of lots of the news that we have to tell, it gets invisible too. That part of the thing that sort of becomes an assaultive part of the work that you do also becomes invisible. And so I thought that was where I'd like to spend my time, to think about some of the ways, especially as Black storytellers, the invisible piece of what becomes an insult or assault in the context of the work you do starts to show up. And so I'm going to walk us through 5 different places where I think that that's relevant for our conversation. One is staying intact when you can't stay separate. The other is racism is not the only issue. The third is racial trauma isn't just for people like me, psychiatrists. And all lives matter is just another way of saying. And then finally, I'll get to self-care. So for me, certainly when I think of first responders, I think of those people in my field who are emergency medicine, who are the police officers, firemen who respond immediately. But I also think that journalists get overlooked a lot of times as first responders because they are first on the scene to tell the story. They're first on the scene to see all the gory details, the elements in the raw that then get captured in a narrative and then brought to us. Those of us in the community, are transported by the good skill of the narrator to kind of be a blank slate and just tell from their perspective. But that takes some compromise and sacrifice and a bit of hitting. So it requires us, in some ways, to check ourselves at the door. I know in my psychiatry practice, I kind of have to check myself at the door. I think journalists also potentially have to check themselves at the door in order to be neutral when it comes to that. But then there are times when the nature of the story, the George Floyds, the Breonna Taylors, the Ahmaud Arbery's start to not only just reverberate for those in the community at large, but the journalists themselves, the narrative that starts to emerge from there starts to become something that's just too hard to escape. And in some respects, in my world, we have a word for that called vicarious trauma. And it is a way in which we recognize that there's a way of sort of sitting in the milieu, in the climate, in the moment of an experience that you are not necessarily the direct recipient of, but somehow has an impact on you. That's vicarious trauma. And when you are telling a story, and what's so interesting is that in our diagnostic statistical manual, they've expanded the definition of trauma to include first responders now, because they recognize that those who sit and tell the stories from the perspective of the first on scene are in fact exposed to lots of traumatic and stressful material. As Black storytellers, especially when you're in the context that we've been in that has awoken in the last 3 to 4 years, the story around who is at the center of that, the identity of that Black male, that Black woman, that Black child, that Black girl, starts to then become something that you have a hard time avoiding. And I was in a conversation and heard from a journalist that she was even asked, well, what do you think about this? Which is something unusual to happen, merely because the content, particularly, let's say, around George Floyd, was so intense that she became part of the story as a Black woman. Those moments are becoming much more powerful, but also in their power, there is this idea that they are also causing more stress. And the reality for us, and I think this is something that potentially doesn't meet the medical world long before we ever get to the medical world, just in your experience and work as journalists, that stress starts to tip the scale to becoming toxic, becoming way too much. And what we define toxic stress as a physiologic stress response that's excessive or prolonged. You can't turn it off. And while that may not be the narrative for every moment, in every encounter, in every event, in every story, there is the tendency that when there are so many stories of Black lives to talk about, and so many stories of Black trauma to reference, that the level of stress that you live and that sort of becomes native to you starts to really build and can get to toxic levels. And when it's toxic, when it gets to those toxic levels, it actually changes how your mood is. It changes your level of irritability, your energy, your sleep. And so to have a conversation about burnout for Black storytellers, particularly at this time, is, I think, profound. And one of the places I think that we talk about, and when we talk about being Black storytellers and the toxic stress level, is the idea of how do you enter the story room? How do you enter the newsroom and feel like you've got a place to anchor yourself and anchor your story? And the reality is there's a huge conversation that we are starting to have around what does it really mean to be in the room, who's in the room, what's invited into the room, and how do we know that invitation is actually something that's safe? Because before, and probably still exists now, is a lot of code switching. Code switching is you can talk, appear, behave, express yourselves in certain ways that are comfortable to others in the room and not for everyone in the room. And then you do that, but in doing so, you sort of gain a possibility for social promotion and promotion on in the sphere of your job. But it also means that you are also at much more much more capacity for stress and anxiety. That the code switching asks you to set aside part of your natural self, and that takes effort. It takes work, way too much energy. And when doing so, one of the things we're becoming much more aware of, particularly because that there's a swing in the other direction, is that there's also erosion of the self. There's erosion of the actualizing self, the person who says, I like the students who were asking, well, what do I do about this question and how do I get my ideas out there? If you are feeling like you're spending most of your energy code switching, there's no way to have energy to think creatively about, well, how might I think differently about how to get my ideas out there and hold to my ideas and commit to those ideas. Beyond the toxic stress, though, one of the things that I love to talk about is this idea of where PTSD is. And so as a psychiatrist, no one wants to hear me coming because I'm coming with pathology. I'm coming with diagnosis. I'm coming with the illness. I'm going to tell you about yourself. But one of the things I think is really useful from the psychiatric perspective is the idea about how some of the things that Black journalists and Black storytellers navigate on a daily basis gets overseen or overlooked in how they are managing healthy and wellness. One of the things so I go back to my PTSD story. So PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and we're very familiar with it when it comes to veterans. We know that that is something that exists. What we don't know is that there are ways in which each of us potentially can identify those in our lives who are walking wounded, who are walking with symptoms of traumatic stress, even in their workplace. Someone who, for instance, and these are the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So negative changes, the inability to trust others, numbed emotions, decreased concentration, avoidance, which is avoiding talking about events or going to places or people who trigger your memory of those events, intrusive thoughts, recurrent memories of traumatic event, reliving or retelling of an event, disturbing dreams or nightmares, and then reactive symptoms, becoming startled or frightened and easily, or self-destructive, irritable, angry, and always on the lookout. My mnemonic for this is Nair. If anybody remembers that hair removal product, this is my mnemonic. But when I think about how we might make use of some of my skills in the newsroom and in the journal Black storytelling world, I think about how PTSD potentially transcends into the newsroom. One of the ways in which I think I see it is someone says, well, why are you always talking about race? Right? Well, one of the ways that shows up in my algorithm of PTSD is reliving of the event. There are ways in which we redo to undo, meaning we tell the stories again and again to try to come up with a different ending, to try to rectify the disruption or the default the insult that happened. Or for instance, someone comes in, they're always angry. We've heard that. And maybe it's been said by a few that we know. But that could also be a symptom of tipping the scale on a toxic stress level to maybe traumatic experience rather than neutral experience. So one of the things I think we really tend to overlook, particularly when we're talking about wellness, burnout, is the idea that we have walking wounded among us. And there are indicators that are clearly visible for us to point them out. The other place I like to spend most of my time these days is around the idea that we are no longer sort of relegated to conversations about just racism. And can I just tell you, I'm one person who's happy about that. And I know, and I'll tell you why though, because it may not be self-explanatory. That racism, I think, the idea of racism limits the conversation to a moment in time, in one encounter, one interaction, where in actuality, what we're really talking about, if we were to be really honest about our US American socialization, is it's the racial socialization that has happened. It's the racial socialization that has embedded itself in every system of our American culture because it's our socialization. It's how systems were built. It's how we know how to act. It's how we know how to engage, how to promote ourselves in certain ways, which directors to speak to and how to speak to them, because that's how the socialization process allows us to advance and survive it. So one of the important things I think when we're talking about burnout and surviving as Black storytellers is understanding this concept that we are all embedded, not just Black members, all of us are embedded in a process of socialization that has made race a priority in it. I have a quote from a gentleman who says that race is not the social construct, society is. That we bring collective ideas together to create social systems that become society. And in society, we decide what things are prioritized. In ours, race is. In ours, the distinction between white culture and the not dominant white culture and non-dominant culture. But anyway, here in this image, there's where I'm referencing Maslow. And if any of you know the story, Maslow went to Canada in 1938 to visit with the Blackfoot Nation tribe. And he came up with the hierarchy of needs from his visit to the Blackfoot Nation. But what he did is he took it from the lens of whiteness. Because whiteness's cultural norm is individuality. But when you really look at what the Blackfoot Nation actually had in its tenets around their structure of how we are to survive, self-actualization was the thing that they were pointing to as most important, not individuality. And so if we're socialized, those of us who are socialized potentially in leaning towards a Blackfoot Nation orientation where community, family, connectedness are priorities for us, our socialization constantly is butting up against a social system that is not has that different priority. Nothing wrong or right about it, but it's a reality. And so once we come to the place where we recognize that reality, then we have different formulas about how we resolve the conflicts we experience, the stress we experience, the disconnects we experience as a result of that. Self-actualization, wait, let me just look at my notes for a second, because self-actualization says to you, this is what I want to make sure I don't forget. It says to you that you are important, that nothing shall overtake your capacity to adapt, adopt, and adjust sufficiently. But if you don't, if you decide that socialization for you is going to be acquiescing, you are giving over to the idea that life is going to be full of emptiness, self-hatred, and self-loathing. It doesn't just happen in the perils of the streets against police profiling. It happens in the medical industry. It happens in corporations. It happens in the newsroom. It is not just relegated to the streets. And so I think it's really important to recognize that anytime this social agent starts to work itself into systems which it's already in, they already exist, that we have to be mindful that we are constantly navigating that and navigating them with some thoughtfulness. Let me give you another example of socialization. Anyone know this image? Can you tell us what it is? Yes. It's the doll test, right? It's a doll test, and this is, oh my goodness, just lost his Clark. Mamie and Kenneth Clark. That's Kenneth Clark. His face is cut out, and this is one of the kids in the study. And this is part of the research that was used to build Brown versus Board of Education, to move us into integration out of segregation. The idea from this image and their study was that Black kids are less likely to see themselves positively because of the difference that we're seeing through segregation. So they're not seeing themselves positively, and it's because of segregation. When we took a closer look at this and put it through the lens of socialization, when we look at it through the lens of socialization, what we begin to understand is this is not about Black kid identity. This is about a process of pressures of socialization that begin to inform identity. So this image is no longer just about a kid saying that he doesn't want to be Black. He wants to be white. This is about, if you really understand it, a social system in being so imposed on a life that it changes how he prioritizes his importance and his value. And why is that important? Because all of us are bringing ourselves into the room. All of us are coming in with a narrative and something potentially that feels like a pressure to change our own story, to offset what we think are priorities and values to what might be more preferential in a socialized system, at least based on race. The reason I bring this up is because I want us to continue to stay mindful that that's happening. And I want to reiterate the idea that it's not about racism, because the problem becomes when we start to really minimize the issue as about racism, then it starts to really, we start to we lose track of the fact that there is a huge system in place of socialization that constantly is at work. I have 3-year-olds. I have 9-year-old patients who are already saying, I'll tell you a quick story. A 9-year-old patient who came into the hospital to be admitted because he was suicidal. He did not want to live with his aunt anymore, who had taken over guardianship of him because his mom had been in prison or gone to jail because of drugs. So the aunt took him in. He said he came in suicidal because I don't want to live with my aunt anymore. I said, oh, well, why not? Because whatever reason, she's too rude, she's too mean, I don't like her, she doesn't go out with me. And then I said, well, where are you gonna go? Like, if you don't go with your aunt, your mom's not there, there's no place else for you to go. He said, I'll go with a white family. At 9 years old, he'd already been socialized to believe that that was a better outcome. And maybe in some respects, it was, but he stayed in the hospital for 3 months because he was insistent that Black was not good enough for him. So keeping that in mind, one of the other places I like to spend a little bit of time is the All Lives Matter. And, you know, when we're talking about all lives, the issue has always been that Blacks weren't necessarily included in all. Blacks weren't included in the liberty and justice for all. Blacks weren't included in the Constitution when we talked about all, at least in this country. And so the idea, we can all get behind the idea that all lives matter. I don't think that anybody would argue against that. The problem is that all lives was not always synonymous with the inclusion of Black lives. And so even in the newsroom then, the question becomes, are Black lives mattering there too? Is there some way in which the conflict between what is important in the all lives is now being, Black lives are now being relegated to something less important? And if we say that that's the case, we're really talking about censorship. We can be honest. And censorship has no place in journalism. We tell the stories, we tell them honestly, we tell them that in a ways that will connect with the lives that they represent. How do you censor that? So here are some of the things I think are important when we're talking about protecting, preserving, perpetuating our Black lives well. And these are images that I think are just representative of the idea that Black identity is important. And, you know, that's something that can potentially just be, you know, it's just something you say. Black identity is important. But as a Black writer, a Black storyteller, pardon me, if you are walking into a room and don't feel like your presence is welcomed, don't feel like you feel like you constantly have to fight or negotiate or navigate who you are in that space, you will reel back and adopt an identity that is not your own, that is not authentic, and because of its lack of authenticity, loses its power. But if we rely, the rest of us rely on you as our communicators, as you as our storytellers, the idea of you being in the room authentically is valuable to us. It's not just the stories that you tell, because it's the stories you tell about us. It's the stories that you give power to, that from our perspective. And I think that it's important then to not be threatened by the idea that positive Black identity is out there, because it has to be. In order for Black voice and Black life and Black existence to persist, there has to be positive Black identity. And that is at the core of self-preservation. Self-preservation says, I'm rooted in self-care. I have to be here. The other thing that I think are important when we're talking about persistence in Black storytelling and fighting burnout is the idea of community. So the newsroom is no stranger to the idea that teams and alliances are important to building and feeling strong and effective as communicators. But that's the same thing with any other group, or particularly with the Black community and with Black individuals. If you go into a space and feel like your voice is the only voice in there that's going to be representative of you as a Black person or the Black community that you feel you represent, then it's going to be hard to feel like you can speak up, you can speak to, you can speak out. However, if you have a community behind you, even if it's a community outside the newsroom, if you have a community behind you, your capacity to speak and stand more authentically, powerfully, boldly, safely is much more likely to occur. And then the other thing that I have in my Storyteller Survival Toolkit are these 3 things I call fill, flow, flush. And what I suggest is that at the beginning of each day, you fill it with images of yourself standing firmly, boldly, and confidently in your Black identity. What that means is taking a moment to do some visualization, taking a moment to pause and meditate, taking some time to pray or to listen quietly. What it does is it gives you the power of your existence in that moment. It gives you back what has been taken from you, and you control it. So if you start the day in the driver's seat in your mind, we know everything starts with the vision. And with the vision, without a vision, men will perish. So to begin the day with the vision of yourself, that is the one that is empowered, will then be followed by the flow. And the flow is the actions that you put forth in that day, whether it is wearing a certain kind of hairstyle, wearing a certain type of clothing outfit, deciding that you're going to take a moment or two to listen to a podcast that's enriching and encouraging and invigorating or strengthening, a way to form yourself as a Black individual in each space that you stand in each moment that you stand in, is a way to flow through your day with continued wellness and prevention of burnout. And then finally, this flush. And flush is what it sounds like. It's at the end of the day, putting aside all the stuff, the gunk that came at you for that day. I know people who have decided that they write it out. Even though you're journalists and you write all the time, some people take their journals and write this stuff out just so they can get it out of them. They'll talk to a good friend just to get it out of them. Some people don't talk at all. They'll sit and take a shower or take a bath or soak their feet. But something about setting apart the parts of the day, the parts of the world, the parts of the social systems that we've had to go up against, such that you can stay intact and you can navigate each day anew with a new power and a new vision for who you are representing and how you represent, how you show up. Then the last thing I'll offer you are some tools that would be really useful as resources for Black storytellers. The first is the NAP ministry. How many of you know of it? Yeah, I know. It's becoming a big thing these days. And you can do it in your own time, but it's a program around how to take back your own authentic self, time, power, resources. And then Huru Space. Anyone know about Huru Space? Amazing. Huru Space is a moment where it's sort of like the Kupalu for Black people. And it's not just for Black people, but it's oriented in the Afrocentric culture, so that she quiets the room. You are the only person there. She feeds you. They provide sort of everything that you need, but they give you a restorative place to go to, Huru Space. And then one of the things that I think is really, really valuable, because what we invest in is what we value. I believe that there's a way. I was just telling a friend of mine the other day that I have this new theory, and I have to do some research to see if anybody else has come up with it, but I think I'm probably the first one, that self-preservation above self-esteem is what Black men give to Black families. That the idea that we can lean on and be taught by men who have had to stand in the place against an aggressor and learn how to navigate successfully, taking the wisdom from that and then transporting and translating that for the lives of the rest of us, whether it's the boys in our family or the girls in our family, is powerful. And it's under acknowledged and under recognized as a valuable piece. So I put this up here about Campaign for Black Male Achievement, because the Black men are, as much as Black women are valuable, our Black men bring something to the lives of Black people that needs to be recognized, celebrated, and encouraged. The other thing that is up here is the African American Male Wellness Organization. It's a nonprofit that upholds the wellness for Black men, primarily boys and men, and has a number of different resources that they pull upon to invite and encourage wellness for Black men. Back to the idea that I believe that the more we center and value and invest in Black male lives, we will see the community continue to turn. And then finally, the Race Recovery Project, a shameless plug. This is my nonprofit organization. And it is an organization, and I'll tell you the story behind how it got founded. It's an organization that I founded 2 years ago, and it came out of an experience I had in my own newsroom. Let me tell you the story. So I don't know if you've noticed this yet, but I'm a Black woman. All right, good. We clear on that? Okay, good. I'm a Black woman pediatric psychiatrist. And more often than not, Black females or women of color and their children come to me for care. They seek me out. One day, I had a white male bring his white male son for me to treat. And I thought, what the heck is this? I just thought, okay, I'm a community doc. There are a lot of poor families. I'm just gonna write it off as I'm one of the few pediatric docs in the area. There were no other options. 3 months into our work together, one of the community members who was working with the family said, I just want to tell you something. I don't know if you noticed this. I said, what was it? He said, did you see the swastika tattoo on his neck? And I said, no, but I'll look for it the next time I'm in session with them. The next time I'm in session with them, do you think I saw it the first time? who thinks I didn't see it the first time? That I really didn't see it. I saw it. I'd seen it. I blocked it out. That thing was so threatening to me. It was such a display of violence, hatred for me in the room, for my identity, for what I represented, that I had to block it out. I didn't realize it though until someone brought it to my attention. They're like, Xenia, it was the middle of summer. It's huge. How did you miss it? So I realized what happened in the room that day. I realized that I operated in a defense mechanism that Black people operate in every day. We start checking off things. We start closing our eyes to things because they become too threatening and too assaultive. And then I thought, so if I'm doing this and I'm in the room with the woman, I'm in the woman in the room with the power, what happens when I'm not in the room with the power? And what happens to everybody else I know who has no MD behind their name to muscle? That's why I began the Race Recovery Project. It's a place where I invite individuals to come in and be authentically Black, a place of safety, a place of community, and a place where we build positive identity. I recognize that there are socialized systems, not racist, socialized systems, a system of socialization that potentially continues to push up against any other cultural norm. And if you're in that space where that is what's happening for you in the newsroom, in the medical room, in the corporate room, depression, anxiety, and God forbid, worse than that, can be the end of the story. I don't think that has to be the case. So I invite us all to think about how we might look at socialization and our socialized systems a bit differently, look at how the culture of what happens in the newsroom gets played out, what gets prioritized, what gets preferentiated, yeah, whatever that word is. And I'm going to end with that. Thank you all for your time and your attention, and I'll take any questions that you might have. Yes.
So I'm fascinated by your ability to have blocked that.
Are you?
Mother is a forensic psychiatrist, so my question to you is, are you in therapy, and did you discuss your coping mechanism strategy with your therapist?
That's a great question. So I'll repeat it for people who didn't hear it. So her daughter is a forensic psychiatrist, and she understands the process of kind of operating in defense mechanisms. And her question to me was I in therapy, and did I share that in my therapy session? So at the time I wasn't. At the time I wasn't. I've been in 10 years of psychoanalysis. So what I did is I had a conversation with someone who I felt really comfortable in psychoanalytic theory and conversation. And so we talked, that's how it came up. Because I was writing about, I kept writing, let me tell you, talk about redo and undo. I kept.
What was the person's race?
She was white. Let me tell you the story. So I kept writing about cultural anxiety and I couldn't get it right. I kept, and so eventually I got to this writing editor, this writing mentor of mine, and she said, I know why you keep talking about anxiety, cultural anxiety, because you have cultural anxiety. And I told her the story. And she said, well, of course you saw the tattoo. I was like, I didn't see that tattoo. She said, yes, you did. That's how I came to understand the process that I had actually, that started to unfold for me and started then become clear for me about how we navigate generally.
There was a student earlier who was very pained. She said she was so nervous that she sat down to ask her question. And it had everything to do with something that I had never experienced but learned from my grandniece, which is that imposter syndrome, right? Now, I'm going to ask in the context of what we just talked about. That young sister seemed to have been disturbed by the possibility that she could have been given advantage because of George Floyd's murder and she's Black. That bothered her a lot. And in the sense of imposter syndrome, seeing but not seeing a swastika, coping mechanisms, is this more of what we are going to see today? And I'm asking it this way. I didn't experience this era, but during the era of segregation in the South, I have heard in many instances where African Americans who were educated in public schools said their public school experience was better
Yes.
in segregation
Yes.
than it was in integration.
Yes.
So somewhere in here, it's an
Yes.
all connected question. So can you just
Unpack it for you? I'll unpack it. First off, can I just say something about imposter syndrome? So imposter syndrome, if anyone hasn't heard, everybody heard. Okay, I won't talk about it. But I will say this. I don't believe in imposter syndrome. I believe in impersonation syndrome, where you walk into a space and impersonate what you think is the desired, preferred identity. And then if you can't impersonate it well enough, the disconnect, the disparity starts to become distressful, uncomfortable, and disorienting. And so you can have someone then say, I don't think I should be this, I don't think I should have this because I don't deserve it. I didn't get it because of the merits of what I was able to accomplish being what they say I should be. People call it imposter. I feel like that alludes and sort of infers that I am potentially trying to be something that I should be something that I'm trying to be something that not being something that I should be. Thank you. Impersonation says I'm trying to be something that I shouldn't be. Now, to your question about the defense mechanisms, I think for me in that moment, I probably was, I had not had this awareness about socialization. And I promise you that was the moment that it started to unpack for me, that I started to really start to look at different places where I could walk in the room differently because I could understand what was happening around me differently. I was probably operating out of impersonation syndrome, where I was trying to walk into spaces, be something, be somebody else, do something, and feel like if I wasn't accepted, it was because of something about me, not about the room or about the space I was in. But thankfully, and if you have a quick second to tell you about the groundwater theory. So the groundwater metaphor says that, and this is how I came to racial socialization as the cornerstone of how I understand racism. Racism in itself is a delusion. The socialization process, that process of us coming together and forming society, it's a construction, is how we get to racism. But groundwater theory says, if you have a lake in the back of your house and you decide you're gonna go fish, and there's one fish that comes up belly up, you think something's wrong with the fish. You're like, okay, something's wrong with that one fish. Then you go, I really wanted to get some fish, so let me go to the other lake next door to my neighbor's lake. You go to that lake, and not only is that one fish belly up, the whole lake is belly up. So you're like, okay, so it's not the only fish, so it wasn't a fish problem, so it's the lakes. Truth is, then you go to another lake, and another lake, and all the fish are belly up. You no longer think it's just the lakes, it's the groundwater. It's the thing that connects the lakes. 95% of the fresh water in the world resides under the earth, the thing that connects the water streams. So racial socialization is that thing that connects the water streams. It's the systems in which we are indoctrinated. We didn't choose it. And racism, someone can say, well, I wasn't racist and I didn't do this and I didn't own slaves. But we are all indoctrinated in a system of socialization that has hierarchied race. Hierarchied a whole bunch of other stuff too, but for Black story writers, hierarchied race in a way that makes it difficult to walk in the room as a Black person, because that is hard not to hide. As a Black person, not in conflict with it. I think I have my cue.
I have a question. So Those of us who work in newsrooms and those of us who are teaching students and teaching them to be into newsrooms, we often talk about microaggressions. Can you kind of give us one example of a microaggression and an appropriate response to that? Because, you know, as we all know, there can be something that's said that throws off your whole day in a newsroom, in any situation. So just an example of that, and maybe like a coping mechanism.
Trying to think of a good one.
I can give you an example. I'll
will
just
you-
give an example of me years ago being out in the field on a story, and it was myself and it was a white reporter, and the person that we were going to interview says to the white reporter, "Oh, you must have went to Yale or Harvard," and she said, "No, I went to Bridgewater State." And then the person turned to me and he said, "Well, did you even go to college?" I said, "Yeah, you know, I went to Emerson here in Boston." Yeah, that's a macroaggression. Sorry, that was a macroaggression. Okay, so, all right. So in that instance, or in the instance of something a little more slight, what is a good way to move forward and try not to internalize it,
that's a
but
great
still be able to function and do your job?
So one of the things that I talk about is how, thank goodness I have a lens. Well, I've come to understand a little bit more in my psychiatric and psychoanalytic world and viewpoint that there are things are bigger than they potentially seem, obviously. And so one of the things I come to understand too is how my dignity is always at stake. Like, if I have nothing else, I don't have Black identity in spaces, I don't have cultural priority in spaces, but I have my dignity. And when my dignity gets assaulted, I can easily come to the place where I feel like, okay, it's on now, because that's all I got. That's all I've got. But when you come to be able to sort of step outside of it and understand, you're no longer your dignity is representative of the idea that you have nothing else. And the space that is starting to affront and confront you in your dignity is doing that because of dysfunction rather than power. You look at it differently. You approach it different. And so I might say, you know, my grandmother might say, your slip is showing. And for those of you who don't know what that means, you just revealed a little something about yourself you didn't want to. And I might really be direct about that, maybe in a way that's somewhat playful, humorous, but say, I feel like you just displayed a bias that may be something you want to take a closer look at.
And I offer that last night we talked about this at dinner. And my tried and true question back is,
If someone said that to me, I would, and I have done this in corporate America, did you really mean to ask me that? Did you really intend to say that to me?
That's a great point.
And that gives them a moment to, what do you mean? No, did you really think about that? Is that what you wanted to ask me? And then I almost always, even from the CEO, got, oh, no, I didn't mean it that way. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you all. It was wonderful to spend lunch with you.